You're listening to Listen More with Paige Krystal Wilcox. This is a podcast where I listen to people from around the world offer their opinions, insights, and reflections of characters similar to themselves. Something that I do on this podcast as a sign of respect is to allow each guest to introduce themselves in the way that they see fit. Without further ado, could you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Okay, hello everyone. My name's Allie, last name XU, so pronounced Su or Shu in Chinese. I was born in Shanghai, China, and moved to Australia when I was 15 years old. And part of my identity, who I am, I've been asking myself this question on this journey of finding out who I really am. Work wise, I've been trained as a pharmacist and also just finishing my Master of Chinese Medicine to search a holistic way of healing to help people to be healthier and happier. Talking about labels, I'm female and I am married. My parents both came from China, so very strong Chinese tradition. While living in Australia, very westernized way of education. So I have this conflict or combination of both very strong culture inside of me. That's the interesting part, but also confused part.
It's very interesting. Most of my guests so far are living in countries that they were not born in, which is really
Mm.
fascinating to me. But they all have very completely different ways that they experience the world. Obviously, this podcast is about media, about stories.
Mm.
So it could be video games or TV shows, movies, books.
Mm. Mm.
Do you think that your difficulty finding yourself between these conflicting cultures has any link to not seeing that represented?
This is a really good question. I guess I haven't seen my particular story seen on movies or TV shows or in books. All the people I know, when they're born here or before they even understand the home culture, even though they speak that language. But I'm different. I came to Australia when I was 15. I already had a world view and speak fluent language, had my connections and friends, but I'm still under 18. Like, I'm still in my teenage years and still figuring out myself, learning about the world. So I adapted the other half in a Western country. So I have a different story. Um, you know, I remember high school, we studied Looking for Ella Brandy. I think her story, I can relate parts of it, but she grew up in Australia. It's different struggle, but I can see that generation because my mom's here, my grandma was here, but my grandma was in her 80s when she moved over. So she didn't work or she didn't, like she wasn't connected with the outside society. And my mom had, they're working in Australia when in her, like she moved over in her 50s. She was still working, but she only like was involved in the Chinese community. She wasn't connected with the Australian community. She didn't even need to speak English much living in Australia because of the community. So I felt like I'm almost like the first generation moving to Australia, facing everything. I was the one helping out the bill. I was the person representing the family because I can speak English, was doing everything. So I guess I haven't seen any literature or movies or TV shows representing me.
Do you think that's something that you would like to see?
Yeah, I think that will definitely help me to reflect as a mirror, reflect and help myself, help me on this journey of figuring out who I really am. And it'd be better for other people to understand me as well when they if I'm represented, if my story is represented in movies and stories.
I think there is a correlation between how you were treated and how characters like you are depicted in stories, because if you're the first person like you that someone is meeting, all they've got to go on is stories. And if there are no stories, they'll think about something that they think is similar
Mm-mm.
and they'll make assumptions based on that and usually treat you based on that. I love stories about people who've had to adjust from one culture to a different culture, because been a big part of my family. Even though I was born here, I was raised with the stories of other places.
Also, like me comparing to people who migrate to Australia in their 20s for university or for, to work, I'm then very different to that a group of people again, because I sort of spent like half of my teenage year in Australia. Like I didn't come as an adult. So I've spent some time like in the past 2 months online speaking Chinese in the Chinese online society. I've realized how like that how much, even though we're speaking Chinese, fluent Chinese to each other, I felt this huge gap in understanding. I felt like I was not understood. People treat me like a Chinese person. I don't know what it is, but it's the culture, it's the understanding, it's how then we're talking about the Chinese government. I feel misrepresented. Western country people's view about China is all this CCP, it's the government really. But really people are different. People have a different story. But at the same time, the government is so influenced on the people, their world view is only what the government tells them. So when I come along and talk to people in China, being, I've seen the other half of the world, and talking to people in China, I feel really difficult to communicate because they have this assumption of the world in those conversations. When I actually talk to Chinese people, whether I thought I'm more Chinese, but really like that's why I feel like I've lost of identity almost.
So much of your adult self has been shaped by where you live now and the culture that you're navigating now. It sounds like the Chinese people you communicate wouldn't have access to as many stories as you've had access to about the world outside of China.
What you've just said, that reminds me how important it is then to have a representation of stories, different stories. It's very interesting. Like China is so big. People just within China, if you're from south and north, people feel difficult to communicate because they have different culture. Even though they speak the same language, they have the same from the same country. I guess I'm only talk the people, the group of people I talk to that only listen to the stories that was given to them. There's other Chinese people being travel around the world, being outside of China. I felt easier communicating with them. Led me to realize how important what you're doing is to bring that variety of different stories to those people so they can see outside of where they are.
We can never really see outside of our own experience because
Mm.
we've only had our own experience. Humans connect so strongly with stories, and there's such a great way to learn about other people.
Mm.
And
Yeah, love what you're doing.
I knew you would be an excellent person to have as a guest just because of the work that you've started with your podcast. The way that you think about things and question things. There's been this real push to have diverse stories and diverse characters. And now that people are starting to pay attention, I think it's time that we start making sure we're doing that properly.
Mm.
Do you feel that if a story is made about someone with a similar experience to you, do you have a feeling about how the creator, the writer, or director should approach that?
Mm. It's very interesting. When I grew up in China, where I would be told there are certain rules, so I grew up with very distinct black and white understanding of the world. But then, as I hear more stories, I talk to more people, and I realize there is no right or wrong. There is no good or evil if you behave certain ways. Like it's really what we put there to control. I've realized that we're all human. Why are we really hating each other so much that really to destroy each other by putting these rules, by putting the standard up, and by telling each other you can't be this, you can't be that. I mean, I just want to put it out there, as well as writers and directors in the films, in all this work sometimes can really steer from a God's perspective. You can put this right or wrong in your writing that really hurt people. Yeah, sure, we need to have an angle where we're telling a story, but I realized growing up, I've watched a lot of films like in China, but all these films has a goal is to educate me, to tell me what to do, what not to do. Like you have so much power to determine who I'm going to be, who I'm going to believe. So just want to put it out there, whoever's creating, or if you're a writer, if you're creating shows, is hey, why don't you just put it out there without having the right or wrong, without having the boundaries? Let that person decide. But again, you know, obviously there's two sides of the coin. I'm watching it. So I also need to start to develop my own thinking process, not just to accept whatever creators put it out there. But since you're talking about this, I just want to put it out there.
It sounds like we could get into a completely separate conversation about the intelligence of the audience and how much responsibility is on the audience to decide how they're going to receive a message. Because it differs from person to person. And I do strongly believe that repeated media has a huge influence on you, especially if you're not aware that it's happening. But also it's very different, I think, depending on your stage of development in life. If you're younger and you're still developing some aspects of your mind, stories and how stories are told are going to have a bit more of an impact versus an adult like you and I now going into something. We'll probably recognize something that we have a problem with or that we disagree with. We're not just going to accept it. That could be an entirely separate conversation, and I think it's not quite right for this podcast.
When I say the word Chinese, they already have an image in their head. So how come? Like, where does that come from? Like that image. I really think media has huge power, like, but also responsibility.
Oh, you sound like a superhero. Great power, great responsibility. Is there anything final you'd like to share with the audience?
I really think have an open mind is really going to help us and help other people in our lives to have a better understanding of the world. We're constantly learning about this world. We don't know, the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know anything. Yeah, so why not have an open mind?
You've been listening to Listen More with Paige Krystal Wilcox. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on this podcast, head to my website, paigekrystalwilcox.com. And don't forget to subscribe and share.